The night Philadelphia changed, forever began in silence. March 21, 1980. South Philadelphia slept under cold streetlights while traffic faded into distant echoes along Broad Street. Inside a modest row house, a man long believed untouchable finished dinner with his wife. He had ruled quietly for 2 decades, avoiding headlines, avoiding wars, avoiding the chaos that destroyed other American crime empires. Moments later, shotgun blasts shattered that illusion. The killing was precise, professional, final. Within minutes, one of the most stable mafia regimes in American history collapsed, and the city entered one of the bloodiest leadership wars organized crime had ever witnessed. Philadelphia had never been like New York or Chicago. It was smaller, tighter, more personal. Power here depended less on spectacle and more on relationships built through neighborhoods, unions, docks, and family loyalty, stretching back generations of Italian immigrants who arrived seeking opportunity, but found survival demanded something harsher. Organized crime in Philadelphia formed slowly during the early 20th century, evolving from street gangs into structured rackets controlling gambling, loan sharking, labor influence, and illegal distribution networks. Unlike larger syndicates, Philadelphia's underworld operated through intimate trust. Everyone knew everyone. Betrayal carried consequences not just for individuals, but entire bloodlines. By the 1950s, instability defined the city's criminal hierarchy. Assassinations and factional disputes weakened leadership until one figure emerged who promised something revolutionary for organized crime: peace. Angelo Bruno did not look like a traditional mafia boss. Soft-spoken and deliberate, he preferred tailored suits over flashy displays of wealth. Violence, in his view, attracted attention, and attention invited federal scrutiny. Where others ruled through fear, Bruno ruled through restraint. Under his leadership, the Philadelphia crime family entered what many insiders later described as its golden calm. Gambling operations flourished. Extortion became systematic rather than chaotic. Disputes were negotiated instead of settled with bullets. Bruno cultivated relationships beyond Philadelphia, aligning closely with powerful national crime figures and ensuring his organization remained profitable without provoking unnecessary wars. He earned a nickname that perfectly captured his philosophy: the Gentle Don. But peace inside organized crime is rarely permanent. By the late 1970s, America itself was changing. Federal law enforcement grew more aggressive. Younger mobsters, raised in an era of faster money and rising narcotics profits, viewed Bruno's cautious leadership as outdated. While other families expanded into drug trafficking, Bruno reportedly resisted large-scale involvement, fearing long prison sentences and government crackdowns. To ambitious captains hungry for wealth, restraint looked like weakness. Tension spread quietly beneath the surface. Meetings grew colder, alliances shifted, conversations stopped when certain men entered rooms. Loyalty, once unquestioned, began to fracture under ambition. Among Bruno's inner circle were men who respected tradition publicly while calculating opportunity privately. The mafia's greatest danger was never outside pressure. It was succession. Every criminal empire eventually confronts the same question: what happens when power stops evolving? Federal investigators would later reconstruct the atmosphere of those final months as one defined by paranoia. Informants whispered of dissatisfaction. Surveillance captured increased movement among rival factions. Trusted lieutenants began holding meetings without approval. The organization was no longer unified. It was waiting. On that March evening in 1980, Angelo Bruno returned home unaware that authorization for his execution had already traveled through mafia channels. In organized crime, a boss could not be killed without approval from higher authorities beyond the city itself. The decision represented more than murder. It was regime change. As Bruno sat in his car outside his home, a gunman approached from the passenger side. A shotgun fired through the window at close range, killing him instantly. The message was unmistakable. Philadelphia's era of diplomacy was over. News of the assassination spread through criminal networks within hours. Shock rippled across the American Mafia. Bruno had maintained stability longer than most bosses of his generation. His death signaled permission, perhaps even encouragement, for ambition to replace order. But removing a leader is easier than replacing one. The power vacuum that followed became immediate and dangerous. Senior members maneuvered cautiously, aware that choosing sides too quickly could mean death. Street soldiers armed themselves. Associates vanished temporarily. Longtime allies avoided public appearances. Fear replaced structure. Philip Testa, Bruno's longtime underboss and loyal supporter, assumed leadership soon after the assassination. Known as the Chicken Man, due to his legitimate poultry business, Testa inherited not a peaceful organization but a ticking bomb. He faced factions emboldened by Bruno's removal and younger figures eager to accelerate violence as a tool of advancement. Testa attempted to restore stability, but the environment had already changed. Loyalty now depended on opportunity rather than tradition. Meetings required increased security. Rumors of internal conspiracies multiplied. The same men who sanctioned Bruno's murder watched carefully, calculating whether Testa represented continuity or another obstacle. Less than a year later, Philadelphia witnessed another explosion, this time literal. On March 15, 1981, a powerful nail bomb detonated beneath Testa's front porch as he returned home. The blast tore through the property, killing the new boss instantly and sending shockwaves through both law enforcement and organized crime nationwide. 2 bosses dead in under 12 months. The message to everyone inside the family was clear. Leadership itself had become lethal. What followed was not merely succession, it was war disguised as promotion. Alliances hardened into factions. Suspicions triggered executions. Men who once shared meals now avoided eye contact, unsure who might already have approval to eliminate them. Among those rising through the chaos was Nicodemo, Little Nicky Scarfo, a figure whose approach to power differed radically from Angelo Bruno's philosophy. Where Bruno sought quiet profit, Scarfo embraced domination through fear. Philadelphia was about to learn what happened when restraint disappeared entirely. The city's criminal underworld transformed into an environment where survival depended on anticipating betrayal before it arrived. Bodies began appearing with alarming frequency. Informants emerged under mounting federal pressure. Violence, once avoided, became routine. The leadership wars had begun, and they would nearly destroy the Philadelphia crime family from within. Power in the mafia rarely passes peacefully, but in Philadelphia, succession had become a death sentence. After the bombing that killed Philip Testa in March 1981, fear settled permanently over the organization. The explosion had not only eliminated another boss, it destroyed any remaining illusion that rules still governed leadership transitions. The Philadelphia crime family was no longer guided by tradition. It was ruled by suspicion. Every captain understood the reality. Whoever controlled the next phase of leadership would need more than alliances. He would need absolute dominance. Nicodemo Scarfo had been waiting for exactly this moment. Known throughout underworld circles as Little Nicky, Scarfo was small in stature but possessed an intensity that unsettled even hardened mobsters. Unlike Angelo Bruno, whose authority relied on diplomacy, Scarfo believed fear was the purest form of control. Years spent operating in Atlantic City had hardened him, exposing him to gambling expansion, political corruption, and increasingly violent enforcement methods. Scarfo interpreted Bruno's restraint as weakness and Testa's downfall as inevitability. To him, survival required aggression before opposition could organize. Within weeks of Testa's death, Scarfo began consolidating influence quietly but decisively. Meetings shifted locations. Loyalists were elevated rapidly. Suspected dissenters found themselves excluded from profitable operations. Surveillance later revealed constant movement between Philadelphia and Atlantic City, as Scarfo strengthened financial pipelines tied to casinos and construction rackets. But consolidation alone was not enough. Scarfo understood something fundamental about organized crime psychology. Uncertainty breeds rebellion. Fear eliminates it. The first killings under his emerging authority were calculated signals rather than emotional reactions. Targets were not random rivals, but individuals rumored to question leadership decisions. Each murder carried strategic purpose. Bodies were discovered publicly enough to spread warning, yet carefully enough to avoid immediate federal backlash. Word traveled fast. Under Scarfo, disagreement became dangerous conversation. Associates lowered their voices in social clubs. Longtime members avoided offering opinions during meetings. Loyalty transformed from respect into survival instinct. Philadelphia's mafia culture began changing almost overnight. Scarfo surrounded himself with fiercely loyal younger soldiers, many eager to prove themselves through violence. Promotions increasingly rewarded ruthlessness rather than experience. Veterans who had prospered under Bruno's measured leadership suddenly found themselves marginalized, watched, or openly threatened. Paranoia infected the ranks. Informants later described mandatory loyalty demonstrations, tests designed to ensure obedience. Members were ordered to participate in violent acts, binding them psychologically and legally to Scarfo's regime. Once blood was shared, betrayal became far more difficult. Yet the greatest threat to Scarfo did not come from outside enemies. It came from within his own administration. Salvatore Chucky, Merlino, and other ambitious figures represented a growing faction uncomfortable with Scarfo's unpredictable rule. Earnings disputes intensified tensions. Atlantic City profits created jealousy among Philadelphia crews who felt excluded from expanding wealth streams. Arguments once settled privately now risked execution. Scarfo's temper became legendary. Minor disrespect could provoke deadly consequences. Investigators would later learn that some murders originated from perceived insults rather than strategic necessity. Fear maintained obedience, but it also accelerated instability. Meanwhile, federal authorities watched closely. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had struggled for decades to penetrate Philadelphia's mafia hierarchy. Bruno's quiet management left few witnesses willing to cooperate, but Scarfo's violent governance produced something law enforcement had long awaited: frightened insiders. Each killing increased pressure on members who realized loyalty no longer guaranteed safety. Wiretaps captured anxious conversations. Surveillance teams documented frequent emergency meetings following disappearances. Families of associates began urging relatives to distance themselves from operations. The organization was eating itself alive. One of the most chilling aspects of Scarfo's reign was normalization of violence. Murders became operational tools discussed alongside gambling revenues and loan collections. Execution sites ranged from abandoned lots to basements and secluded industrial areas along the Delaware River. Philadelphia newspapers began reporting an alarming rise in organized crime homicides, though the full scope remained hidden from public understanding. Behind closed doors, Scarfo pushed further. He demanded absolute tribute payments, tightening financial control across all crews. Those who hesitated faced removal. Trusted allies were constantly rotated, ensuring no subordinate gained independent power strong enough to challenge him. Ironically, the strategy that secured Scarfo's dominance also accelerated federal success. The more centralized the authority became, the easier it was for investigators to map responsibility. Informants emerging from Scarfo's inner circle provided unprecedented insight into command structures, murder authorizations, and financial operations. By the mid-1980s, Philadelphia's crime family operated less like Bruno's disciplined enterprise and more like an armed occupation governed by fear. And fear produces mistakes. Scarfo underestimated one critical factor: the cumulative psychological toll on his own men. Constant executions created an environment where cooperation with authorities began to look safer than loyalty. The turning point approached quietly. Several trusted members, facing prison sentences and uncertain survival within Scarfo's increasingly volatile leadership, began secret conversations with federal prosecutors. Evidence accumulated faster than ever before. Recorded conversations captured discussions of murder conspiracies, extortion schemes, and internal disputes. For the first time in its history, the Philadelphia crime family faced danger not from rival gangs, but from inside testimony. Scarfo had won the leadership war, but in doing so, he had triggered the beginning of the end. The empire now stood powerful on the surface, yet beneath it, federal cases were forming piece by piece, witness by witness, recording by recording. Philadelphia's deadliest era was reaching its peak, and the collapse was already underway. By the mid-1980s, fear had become the governing language of the Philadelphia crime family. Under Nicodemo Scarfo, violence was no longer corrective, it was preventative. The organization operated on the assumption that betrayal existed everywhere, even when no evidence supported it. Meetings shortened. Conversations became coded. Longtime members who once viewed themselves as brothers now entered social clubs, scanning exits and studying faces. Scarfo trusted almost no one. Power had isolated him. Inside the family hierarchy, promotions continued, but advancement carried hidden danger. Rising too quickly attracted suspicion. Earning too much money suggested independence. Maintaining friendships outside approved circles risked accusations of conspiracy. Survival depended on appearing loyal while never appearing ambitious. It was an impossible balance. Murders multiplied as Scarfo attempted to eliminate perceived threats before they materialized. Some victims were genuine rivals. Others were casualties of rumor, misunderstanding, or personal grudges elevated into capital offenses. Federal investigators later concluded that internal violence during Scarfo's reign exceeded any previous period in Philadelphia Mafia history. Bodies appeared in car trunks, alleyways, and construction sites connected to mob-controlled businesses. Disappearances became common enough that associates developed routines, checking daily with trusted contacts simply to confirm they were still alive. The psychological environment deteriorated rapidly. Scarfo increasingly relied on a tight inner circle of loyal enforcers, including men whose reputations depended entirely on his approval. Among them was his nephew, Philip Leonetti, who functioned as both underboss and execution coordinator. Leonetti would later describe an atmosphere where murder discussions occurred with disturbing normalcy, sometimes decided within minutes based on shifting moods. The organization no longer pursued stability. It pursued obedience. Atlantic City remained central to Scarfo's ambitions. Casino development created enormous financial opportunity, but competition intensified scrutiny from both rival criminal interests and federal regulators. Control over unions, contractors, and supply chains became battlegrounds where intimidation replaced negotiation. Every dollar generated new enemies. Meanwhile, law enforcement strategy evolved dramatically. Federal prosecutors began applying the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, allowing entire criminal enterprises to be prosecuted collectively rather than through isolated crimes. For the first time, bosses could be held legally responsible for murders they never personally committed. Scarfo's centralized command structure suddenly became a liability. The FBI expanded surveillance operations across South Philadelphia and Atlantic City. Hidden microphones captured conversations inside restaurants, offices, and mob hangouts once considered secure. Agents patiently constructed timelines linking leadership decisions directly to acts of violence. What investigators needed most, however, was confirmation from inside. Scarfo unknowingly created it. Constant executions convinced several members that loyalty offered no protection. Facing lengthy prison sentences and fearing internal assassination, individuals once considered unbreakable began reconsidering silence. The Mafia's sacred rule, omerta, started cracking under pressure. The most devastating fracture came from within Scarfo's own leadership circle. Philip Leonetti, raised inside Mafia culture and deeply involved in the organization's violent operations, reached a breaking point after arrest. Years of fear, combined with growing realization that Scarfo would sacrifice anyone to preserve himself, altered his calculation. Leonetti chose cooperation. For federal authorities, the decision was historic. An acting underboss agreeing to testify provided unprecedented access to operational details, murder authorizations, financial schemes, internal meetings, and Scarfo's direct involvement in leadership decisions. Decades of secrecy unraveled through first-hand testimony supported by recorded surveillance. Inside the Philadelphia underworld, panic spread faster than any previous crisis. Associates suspected everyone. Conversations stopped entirely in public spaces. Some members fled temporarily. Others attempted desperate displays of loyalty hopping to avoid implication. But the damage could not be reversed. Indictments followed. Federal grand juries issued sweeping charges targeting Scarfo and much of the organization's leadership. Prosecutors outlined a pattern of systemic violence, extortion, illegal gambling, loan sharking, conspiracy, and multiple homicides tied directly to command decisions. Courtrooms replaced street corners as the arena of power. During trial proceedings, jurors heard detailed descriptions of executions once hidden behind mafia mythology. The image of organized crime as disciplined brotherhood dissolved under testimony revealing paranoia, impulsive killings, and leadership ruled by fear rather than strategy. Scarfo maintained outward defiance, projecting authority even as evidence mounted. Yet the psychological shift within the organization was irreversible. Members who once feared rival families now feared legal exposure more than internal punishment. The government had achieved what decades of investigations failed to accomplish. It turned the mafia against itself. Convictions arrived with devastating impact. Lengthy prison sentences removed much of the leadership structure simultaneously. Financial networks fractured. Remaining crews struggled to maintain coordination without centralized authority. Philadelphia's deadly leadership wars had reached their climax, not through assassination but prosecution. Scarfo's reign, built on violence meant to secure permanence, instead accelerated destruction. The very fear that maintained his dominance convinced insiders to cooperate, providing prosecutors with the tools needed to dismantle the empire. By the late 1980s, the Philadelphia crime family still existed in name, but its power had fundamentally changed. Trust was gone, experience lost, authority weakened beyond repair. The era of open bloodshed ended not because peace returned, but because too few leaders remained free to continue the war. Yet the consequences of Scarfo's rule would linger for decades. Philadelphia's underworld had survived external enemies before. What it struggled to survive was what came next: life after fear, without leadership strong enough to rebuild what violence had destroyed. By the time the trials ended, the Philadelphia crime family no longer resembled the organization Angelo Bruno once controlled. Courtroom verdicts accomplished what decades of gang wars could not. Leadership disappeared almost overnight. Long prison sentences removed captains, advisors, and soldiers simultaneously, leaving behind an empire stripped of experience and trust. The structure that once governed gambling networks, labor rackets, and Atlantic City operations collapsed into fragments struggling to survive without direction. Nicodemo Scarfo entered federal prison facing life behind bars. Even there, he attempted to maintain authority, issuing instructions through visitors and coded communications, determined to preserve influence despite confinement. But prison walls changed the balance of power. Outside, younger figures competed to inherit what remained of Philadelphia's criminal economy, while law enforcement monitored every attempt at reorganization. The Mafia had lost its greatest weapon: secrecy. Public trials exposed internal mechanics previously hidden from view. Jurors heard how promotions were granted, how executions were authorized, and how fear governed decision-making. Newspapers detailed testimony describing murders discussed casually among leadership figures. The myth of disciplined honor dissolved into documented reality: paranoia, greed, and escalating violence. For remaining members, survival required adaptation. Some attempted to rebuild quietly, returning to low-profile rackets designed to avoid federal attention. Others distanced themselves entirely, choosing legitimate business over constant surveillance. Informants continued emerging throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s, ensuring investigators remained steps ahead of any resurgence. The psychological damage Scarfo's reign inflicted proved lasting. Trust, essential to organized crime, had vanished. Members no longer believed loyalty guaranteed protection. Every conversation carried risk. Every partnership invited suspicion. The leadership wars had taught a brutal lesson. The greatest danger to the Philadelphia Mafia was not rival families or government pressure, but internal ambition unchecked by restraint. Attempts to restore centralized leadership repeatedly faltered. New bosses inherited weakened crews and shrinking revenue streams. Traditional rackets faced competition from independent criminal groups less bound by hierarchy. Technological surveillance advanced rapidly, making old operational methods obsolete. Wiretaps, financial tracking, and expanded federal cooperation transformed organized crime investigations nationwide. Philadelphia's Mafia entered a slow decline rather than sudden extinction. Occasional arrests reminded authorities the organization still existed, but its influence no longer dominated the city's economy or politics. The era when a single boss could stabilize or terrorize Philadelphia had ended. Former insiders later reflected that Angelo Bruno's assassination marked the irreversible turning point. His cautious leadership prioritized longevity over dominance. The men who replaced him pursued power through violence, accelerating short-term control while destroying long-term survival. Leadership wars rarely produce winners. They produce vacancies. By the early 1990s, many of the figures who fought for control were dead, imprisoned, or cooperating witnesses living under new identities. Social clubs once filled with influential captains stood quieter. Younger criminals viewed mafia membership less as opportunity and more as liability. Federal prosecutors considered the Philadelphia cases among the clearest demonstrations of organized crime's internal weakness. The government had not defeated the mafia through overwhelming force alone. It allowed ambition and mistrust to fracture the institution from within. In the end, the Philadelphia crime family was undone by the same forces that shaped its rise: loyalty, power, and fear. Angelo Bruno ruled through patience and survived for decades. His successors ruled through intimidation and lasted years. The deadly leadership wars transformed Philadelphia into one of the most violent chapters in American mafia history, proving that organized crime's greatest threat is rarely external opposition. It is the moment when leadership mistakes fear for strength and violence for stability. Today, traces of that era remain buried in court archives, surveillance recordings, and fading neighborhood memories. The gunshots and explosions that once reshaped the city have long since quieted, replaced by ordinary streets unaware of how close organized crime came to destroying itself entirely. The Philadelphia Mafia did not fall in a single night. It collapsed decision by decision, trigger pull by trigger pull, until nothing remained strong enough to hold power together. And in the silence that followed, one lesson endured across the American underworld. Empires built on fear eventually turned that fear inward. Philadelphia learned that lesson in blood.